Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and today we're going to spend some time in the first hour kind of looking at a couple of things in the news. Some of those relate to the recounts and the legal challenge and all of the rest. Then we'll get into some other issues about the lockdowns and a variety of other topics that we will put on the table. Next hour, we will give a little bit of an update on some of those issues, and then we'll be talking with Lysa Terkeurst. Her book is entitled Forgiving What You Can't Forget, author of some other best-selling books, and this one really helps us to begin to move on past some of the difficulties that we might have faced, and so we'll spend some time with her in the next hour. Then in the third hour, we will have Dr. Richard Land will be with us. We'll talk about the election, and in particular, he wrote a book years ago called The Divided States of America. And if you wanted to get a sense of how divided America is, simply look at the recounts, the recriminations, which we're going to get to in just a minute, as well as just the very, very close votes in so many states around the country. And then before the next hour is over, O.S. Hawkins will be with us. We'll talk about his newest book in the Code series, The Bible Code. We've talked about some of the others, the Jesus Code, the Joshua Code, the Daniel Code, the Believer's Code, the James Code, the Passion Code, and this one is the Bible Code. So it will be, again, a series of conversations on, as we've always said, a variety of different topics. Should there be an investigation into this election? Well, at least two members of Congress that are Republicans think so. That would be Representative Jim Jordan, who is the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, and Representative James Comer, who is the ranking member of the House Oversight and Reform Committee. And they sent a letter to the Democratic leadership demanding congressional investigation into the integrity of the 2020 election. Now, given the investigations that went into the Russia collusion, you would think that those which were based on scant or almost non-existent evidence would certainly justify investigating these elections, because if you listened yesterday, we posted, and it's still on the website, the Here is the Evidence website that goes through all sorts of various allegations, stories, affidavits that have been signed, and others about all sorts of voting irregularities. Some of those involve fraud. Some of them involve mismanagement. Some of them are speculation. Okay, that's enough to merit an investigation. And nobody in this article that I'm reading mentions this, but let me mention it. The two individuals that received this would be Jerry Nadler, who is actually the Democratic chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and the chairwoman of the Oversight and Reform Committee is Carolyn Maloney. Now, nobody mentions this, but I thought, if there's anybody on that receiving end that should say, yeah, maybe we need to look at that, Carolyn Maloney is in the 12th Congressional District in New York. If you've paid any attention at all, I've pointed out how that was one of the most significant races during the primary The one in New Jersey, as I said, was so bad they had to actually run it again in November. And there was some evidence that if it wasn't a primary, they may have tried to run this one again as well, because her opponent alleged all sorts of fraud. Now, she may be coming out of that saying, no, I don't want an investigation, because maybe the fraud allegation might prove that I wasn't supposed to be actually reelected in the primary. But I would think that if there's anybody that's had firsthand experience with all the claims and counterclaims about fraud and election malfeasance, it would certainly be her. So it will be interesting to see whether or not this particular letter falls on deaf ears, or whether or not there is an investigation. But it is certainly one being brought by the ranking members in the Republican side of the House Judiciary Committee and the House Oversight Committee, sending it to the ranking members on the Democratic side of those two committees. And again, Representative James Comer said the 2020 election was full of chaos. Congressional oversight is needed for the American people to have faith in the integrity of our election. Do your jobs and call a hearing. We will see. And I thought I will mention that again next hour. And I was going to move on until just a few minutes ago. I saw this, and I printed it once, and it went somewhere, got it printed again, and here it is. And that is the American Association of Evangelicals have now released a letter also asking Congress and state legislators to take the time necessary to investigate the claims of voter fraud and election theft. Some of the signers of those would be people like the former member of Congress, Bob McEwen. Michelle Bachmann's been on the program before, and of course she's a former member of Congress, also a presidential candidate. Eric Metaxas was one of the signers. James Garlow. Matter of fact, Eric Metaxas said, we are praying for the soul of this nation, that God would reveal the truth. If Biden really is the winner, I will accept the verdict, but we are far from that at this point, he says. Calling for a fair and transparent election is not partisan politics. It's simply demanding that we not erase the very plumb line of American self-government and thereby destroy the republic bequeathed to us by the founders, which itself is a precious gift of God. Another one of the signers, Kelly Monroe Kohlberg, who's been on the program with us before, said Americans rightly hate manipulation and deserve truth. Hundreds of eyewitness testimonies and affidavits merit time for inquiry. We're at a decision point between two conflicting futures for America. If fairly reached, either outcome could be accepted, but to steal an election is to rob citizens of their heritage and desired future. And so there are a number of signatories, and so we'll see. We'll see where that takes us. But those were the attempts to try to call for an investigation. I might just point out that you're now starting to see some articles. My producer, Steve, pointed out one in Time saying that actually all this investigation is doing damage. And most of it is criticizing the Trump campaign, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. But I always love to ask the question, if the roles were reversed, would we be hearing the same concerns from some of those individuals that wrote the articles? And maybe, but I suspect maybe not. That is, again, one of the difficulties, because if indeed you have such a high percentage of at least Republicans, and I suspect if they did a survey of Democrats, they would have some as well, wondering whether or not this election is on the up and up. The constant refrain that, no, there's no evidence of voter fraud. This has been a very transparent election. Just get over it, move on, stop asking these questions. Again, you're not trying to convince yourself, although sometimes, most times they say this, I sort of think, are you trying to convince you or me? But nevertheless, it is a very significant need that indeed, if indeed even after these votes are certified, is there still value in the investigation to learn for the future what we should do, what we shouldn't do, and how to make the system even more secure? I think those are always good questions as well. But we come back from the break, let me get into this, because now kind of controversy in Georgia and Michigan and a number of other places about even certifying the election. We knew this was coming, so we'll be talking about that right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Back in 1996, Samuel Huntington wrote The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order. He predicted the current conflict between Islam and the West. In my book, Understanding Islam and Terrorism, I show how this clash of civilizations has had a profound impact on missions. In the past, countries that were close to the gospel tended to be communist countries. Even so, there is still a significant amount of Christian growth in countries behind the Iron Curtain and Bamboo Curtain. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, many of these countries are now open to the gospel more than ever. Meanwhile, persecution of Christians remains in China. But a new phenomenon has emerged. Muslim countries are now the most resistant to the message of Christianity. Mission work is limited or even non-existent in many of these Muslim countries. This, I believe, represents the greatest challenge for missions in the 21st century, reaching the Muslim world for Christ. Samuel Huntington also predicted a growing conflict between Western universalism and Muslim militancy. In other words, the conflict is between liberal Western democracies and Muslim countries. This presents a major challenge for Christians trying to reach Muslims. When they see the West with its immorality and decadence, they reject it and Christianity. After all, they reason, these are Christian countries and this is what they produce. Therefore, we should be quick to point out, as Christians, we also disagree with much of what some of these countries produce. Whether we are missionaries overseas or missionaries in our backyard, we need to begin to understand the nature of Islam and bring the message of the gospel to the Muslims we meet. I believe Samuel Huntington is correct in his analysis, and we should begin to understand the changing world around us so that we can be more effective for Christ. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to move on in just a little bit past some of the voter recounts and all of the rest, and maybe a little bit later I'll come back to it because there have been some that have not been impressed with the way the Trump campaign and the Trump lawyers have argued their case before the courts, and so I'll give you some of that information in just a minute. And at first I was troubled by that because I was hearing some people that had actually been involved with Donald Trump saying they felt like they made a big mistake letting Rudy Giuliani, that is the former mayor of New York, actually handle some of this. And of course, the other day he was in front of the court. He forgot the judge's name. He mispronounced some things. He just did all sorts of things. We'll get into that in just a minute, which is certainly relevant. But I thought instead let's stay on the issue of recounts for just a minute, because if nothing else, this is why recounts, I think, are important. I have in front of me now 3 different batches of missed votes in Georgia. Now, are any of them enough to overturn Georgia? Well, if I can count up, it doesn't look like it, but then I have other people that say that Georgia may flip. I don't think it makes any difference in terms of the number of electoral votes, but nevertheless, let's count the ways, because you have one in Walton County where they found a number of votes which by and large were again netting a little bit of a lead for Donald Trump. Yesterday, I mentioned the other ones, but let's just remind you of that again, because on Monday in Floyd County, they found 2,600 uncounted votes. And so that was something that were of concern because they were on a memory card and were not actually added to the total. The next day in Fayette County, they found another 2,800 uncounted votes. And again, this one was one on a memory card. And at this point, you have to say, okay, I'm starting to see a trend here in Georgia. Maybe it's time for Georgia to be, in a sense, looking at these issues with the same intensity that 20 years ago Florida did, because Florida didn't seem to have any glitches in the election, and Georgia does seem to have some of those as well. That's one of the reasons why some very prominent Republicans have actually called for the Secretary of State in Georgia to actually resign. And interestingly enough, both senators, Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, have called for that as well. So we'll see where that takes us. But all of that is sort of intramural because the two Republican senators and the Republican Secretary of State probably need to have some kind of unity in the Republican Party because, in case you forgot, we have two U.S. Senate races that are in runoffs January 5th, and that kind of dissension within the party probably isn't going to be real helpful in the future. But let's move from Georgia to Michigan. This has been one of those on-again, off-again situations in which in Wayne County, the Board of Canvassers first actually said they weren't going to certify the election. Then they certified the election. Then they said they wanted to rescind the vote. And it has to do, in large part, to an individual who is a state representative-elect, Abraham Ayash, I think is how you say him. Ayash probably is a better way to say it, in which he actually posted some really significant things. You, Monica Palmer from Grosse Pointe Woods, have a history of racism, are deciding to enable and continue to perpetuate the racist history of the country. And I want you to think about what that means to your kids, and then name the school of their kids, and then talked about the impact of her decision on the black classmates. Well, this has led some people to say, wait a minute, what you're doing is doxing the children of the Republican who you wanted to actually certify the votes in Wayne County. And so this led to all sorts of criticism as well. And so then when they then decided to actually, because of some of the pressure that was being brought on them, actually did certify the votes in Wayne County, he then posted on Twitter, Monica Palmer and William Hartman, you're still racist. And by this time now, everybody started seeing this, and some people said, wait a minute, what you are doing is you're doxing their kids. Now, his reaction was, I don't even know what doxing means. I'm not bullying. I'm the one that's the victim here. Another commentator, Ned Stabler, raised eyebrows when he then talked about the grandchildren of the Republican women, individuals that were supposed to actually certify the election in Wayne County. And so now you have affidavits that came out yesterday, last night, matter of fact, in which two of those individuals, the names I just mentioned a minute ago, of the 4-member Wayne County Board of Canvassers, alleged that they were improperly pressured into certifying the election and accused Democrats of reneging on a promise to audit votes in Detroit. So Monica Palmer, I'll give you her quote here, said, I rescind my prior vote, which she actually said in an affidavit that was reviewed by the Washington Post. I fully believe the Wayne County vote should not be certified. And Palmer and Hartman said in their affidavits they believe that they have a firm commitment to an audit. But Palmer said in her affidavit that the Michigan Secretary of State later said she did not view their resolution asking for an audit as binding. And she said, I feel misled. I stand firm in not certifying the Wayne County vote without an audit. Okay, how do we sort all this out? First of all, we do have a precedent. It goes all the way back 20 years ago in Florida, where there was a certification of the votes in Florida. Remember the hanging chads and all this? Those of you that are older maybe remember some of this. And then later they said they weren't going to certify that according to this Florida Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, you can't on again, off again. Once you certify it, it's done. So the bottom line is that there was apparently some kind of agreement that before we even talk about certifying Wayne County, we want to make sure that there's going to be an audit of Detroit where we think there is maybe some voting irregularities. We won't even call them frauds. We'll just say that something didn't seem quite right. And so that deal, whether it was a promise or a misunderstanding, is one of the reasons why they want to pull it. There's probably no chance that that's going to make any difference. But in the meantime, you have this individual, and he is a state representative-elect, who said, I'm not doxing them, but then gives out the if you will, the school of the children of the people he's trying to pressure. Now, you may not consider that doxing. He says he doesn't even know what it is. I guess I have to believe him on that. But he's now saying he's the victim because once he actually posted all that, then there were all sorts of people on Twitter that responded to him. If nothing else, it illustrates again how much pressure is being put on individuals at every level of this particular situation. If again, all he was doing is honestly saying that, that's fine, but it sure strikes me, and then one other individual bringing up the names of the grandchildren, almost how mean-spirited some of these people are in terms of the vote. And so, again, back to the argument made just a minute ago, you can see why the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee and the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee, and why the American Association of Evangelicals are saying it's about time to maybe do a thorough investigation of what is happening here, because obviously there are a lot of people feeling pressure. And almost everybody in these situations is now feeling like a victim. And I think it's about time to bring a little bit more clarity to a situation that is obviously riven with a fair amount of chaos. So let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into a couple of other issues that are maybe related in the broadest sense, and that is we're starting to see more and more examples of various politicians who set down a set of rules for the coronavirus guidelines and then go out and break those. The most recent one, California Governor Gavin Newsom, but we can also talk about the mayor of the District of Columbia, Muriel Bowser. We can talk about the mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot. We can even talk about the mayor of Philadelphia, Jim Kenney, and there are just all sorts of examples. And because of that, what's happening, number one, is Victor Davis Hanson argued that there may just end up being massive civil disobedience if some of these lockdowns are imposed. And second of all, it gets back to what we call the chump effect. If indeed you feel like some people have to follow the rules and others don't, and you're one of those rule followers, and you're seeing the people that are breaking the rules, after a while, you feel like a chump, and that's the chump effect, which we'll be writing about in future commentaries. And that's why, in some respects, when you can't get your leaders to follow the rules, you have even less likelihood of the followers that are going to follow those rules. And that, of course, is not good for the future of this country, whether we're talking about lockdowns or whether we're just talking about obeying the rule of law in America. So we'll talk about that right after these messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Let's now, if we can, focus some time and attention on the pandemic and the lockdown. And if there's any reason why somebody would not want to be the president or not be a governor or mayor, it's that it's very obvious that we don't know what to do. Of course, the vaccine is coming. But in the meantime, Victor Davis Hanson put it this way. He said, the major takeaway over these last couple of months is that state authorities have no good answers for the public. Out of a need, he says, to do something, they're resorting to lockdowns, noting that European nations are taking the same route. But that is not working very well. If you look at some of the places that have been locked down, either in Europe or even states in this country, sometimes they're having as much problem as those that have not had those lockdowns. We did an interview a while back with Dr. Jay Richards, and he and Doug Axe and William Briggs and others looked at the impact of these lockdowns, and the original assumption that they made at the time was, well, maybe they did some good, but there's the other part of, if you will, a cost-benefit analysis on what happens when you lock people into a home and you don't allow students to interact with one another, that you try to think that maybe they're going to be educated on Zoom when you know darn well it's probably not going to be half as effective as it would be in a classroom when you look at the rise in suicides and the undiagnosed diseases and on and on. So they concluded that probably what they would come up with is, yes, there may have been a little bit of a benefit, but there's an incredible cost. If you go and look at their book, and I would encourage you to do so, because you may be one of those skeptics that say, wait a minute, this is what everybody's calling for. But if you look at their book and look at the graphs, they show you when the lockdowns, and they do this for just about a dozen different states, when the lockdown was implemented, then they go fast forward to about 10 to 14 days and see what the impact is. And the answer is virtually nothing. And so they came to the conclusion that, of course, there was a huge cost, and there was certainly really no benefit. But if you don't know what else to do, that's when you start doing these kinds of things. And that's why people in Europe, leaders in Europe, and even mayors are calling for these very extensive lockdowns. Let's cancel Thanksgiving. Let's cancel Christmas and all of the rest. Anyway, Victor Davis Hanson goes on to say that they're not presenting kind of a cost-benefit analysis of those individuals. And we should look at of course, what he's talking about, not only the death rate, but also look at substance abuse, domestic abuse, pauses in education, missed health procedures. One of the things he said yesterday on Tucker Carlson, I'm afraid that we're going to have massive civil disobedience because for them to have credibility, they cannot be hypocritical. And then he begins to go through how you have so many individuals, what he called marquee officials like House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, California Governor Gavin Newsom, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. All these people violated their own edicts. And so Victor Davis Hanson said they go to hairdressers, they put their kids in private schools, they go to restaurants. So they asking the public to obey edicts that they don't feel apply to themselves. And when you apply that to protest all summer, we saw people out in the streets, no social distancing, no mask, no cleanser, spraying or screaming. And we've even had health professionals who signed a letter saying that it's more deleterious to the health of certain groups not to protest than to risk the virus. And so, of course, we've talked about all of that here on the Point of View program. And it brings me to this very good piece that came out in which it pointed out just the stories that have been unfolding over the last couple of days and in some cases weeks about various leaders. The one that's been in the news most likely is, of course, the California Governor Gavin Newsom. He was spotted at an upscale restaurant. I think it's called the French Laundry of all places anyway. And it was a birthday party for Jason Kinney. And they said it was going to be outside, and they followed all the health restrictions. And then a young woman actually saw that was Gavin Newsom, and took pictures. And then Fox 11 on Los Angeles showed a dozen people sitting together, not a person with a mask on, not a person outside, no distancing whatsoever, in complete violation to everything that are part of the edicts actually brought down not only by the governor of California, but by the various mayors, Los Angeles Mayor Garcetti and many of the others. And so, again, that caused the governor, Gavin Newsom, to say, well, the spirit of what I'm preaching all the time was contradicted. I need to preach and practice, not just preach. But the point is that even after that, one of the spokespeople said, well, the event was considered outdoors and didn't violate any rules. At this point, you've heard the old phrase gaslighting, but, I think it's a terrible phrase, but it's don't believe your lying eyes, just believe what I tell you. You can see the pictures, and there are multiple pictures. You can see a chandelier, you can see windows, you can see walls, and to then say this was outdoors, I mean, seriously, even when we have pictures, I'm still going to maintain that we did everything by the book. And it just, after a while, it gets so frustrating for those of us, as I said, who are rule keepers when we see people who are rule breakers. A couple other examples that are in this article as well. Of course, the D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, she wasn't even that contrite compared to the governor, in which she traveled to Delaware to congratulate President-elect Joe Biden on his election victory, despite the state being on her own travel advisory list, which would then require her to actually quarantine for 14 days, and she did not, and she just dusted off any concern that somebody might raise about that. Another mayor, of course, is Chicago's Lori Lightfoot, who faced a backlash for urging residents to take new precautions soon after she shared a video of herself in a crowd speaking without a mask following the presidential election. And then the one that I thought would add to the list I have yet to mention, and that's in this article too, that is the mayor of Philadelphia, Jim Kenney, who was called out after he imposed a restriction against indoor dining in his city and actually was then spotted at a Maryland restaurant. The spokesman was trying to say, well, actually, it was in Cecil County, which borders Pennsylvania, but nevertheless, you have a tweet that came out that says, I know some are upset that I dined indoors at a restaurant in Maryland yesterday. I felt the risk was low because the county I visited had fewer than 800 COVID-19 cases compared to those in Philadelphia. Regardless, I understand the frustration. And what you get is this sort of, oh, yeah, I guess I should be upset about it, but I'm really not. And one other example, which I think illustrates, again, what we call the chump effect, is in California right now, there are people that are really upset about these various legislators who not only left California, but they went to Maui, and they were part of this, it's supposed to be a conference, but let's face it, it's pretty much a vacation for them and their families in Maui, Hawaii, with the Independent Voters Project, where they are paying for it. Again, that's lobbying, in case you're not familiar with that. And so this, just reading from Politico, said the pandemic may have canceled 2020, but it did not derail an annual gathering of lobbyists and lawmakers on the shores of Maui that brought people from across the country to a luxury resort this week. Roughly 100 people from 4 states converged on the Fairmont Kealani in a 4-day legislative conference organized by the Independent Voter Project. The 18th annual event was third of its largest size, but it still drew all sorts of lawmakers from California. By the way, a few from Texas and Washington State as well. And again, just a good illustration of what I have referred to as the chump effect. We are being played sometimes by chumps. And what's going to happen is that as we see more and more individuals breaking the rules, those of us that play by the rules are going to say, I might as well not take those rules very seriously either, because after all, everybody else seems to be able to break them. And when your leaders are breaking them, that, of course, changes the whole dynamic. One other interesting thing that I might add before we take a break, a new study came out of Denmark, out of Copenhagen. It's a Danish study, in which they found that face masks provide the wearer with very limited protection. They actually did the study back when there were face masks not being worn very often. And so they found that the findings are consistent with previous research. Health experts have long said a mask provides only limited protection for the person wearing it, but it can dramatically reduce the risk to others if the wearer is infected, even when showing no symptoms. Preventing the spread to others is known as a source control. So they're saying there shouldn't be an argument against wearing face masks, but it's just one more study that's come out now published by Reuters, saying they are of limited value, and of course they're not telling us something we didn't really know in the first place. If we go to a lockdown, what's going to be the impact? Well, Stephen Moore, who's been on this program with us, had something to say about that. That's one of the articles from The Hill, and we'll talk about that right after these coming messages. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll finish off on this hour looking at some of the issues in the news. Next hour, we'll be talking with our friend Lysa Terkeurst. All that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me take on two of the articles we've posted on our website, pointofview.net. First one is by Stephen Moore. He's been on the program with us many times before. It's called The Return of Lockdown Lunacy. And he says, in the wake of rising numbers of coronavirus cases and hospitalizations, as so many states, notably run by Democrats, are going back towards economic lockdowns. And he talks about this includes New York, Illinois, Virginia, Michigan, Maryland, Minnesota, California, and Washington. Those like California and Washington have considered full lockdowns. And he says, this means lockdowns of schools, churches, businesses, restaurants, and office buildings. The California governor, who we just talked about, Gavin Newsom, even issued orders on how to celebrate Thanksgiving with no singing, no laughing, no more than 10 people at the table. First of all, he says, who thinks these are unrealistic edicts. Much more worrisome is the discussion from the transition team of Joe Biden over a national lockdown that could last several weeks. And so he points out that if you look at some of the arguments being made, one from an individual at the University of Minnesota said that he wanted such a suspension of economic activities before the backlash and broad alarm of the effects of the recommendation would have, particularly on this administration. He and other advisors to Joe Biden said the reason the last national lockdown in the spring did not work was because it was not, are you ready for this, stringent enough. What more do they want from us, at least is the question that Stephen Moore has. If the lockdown before was not stringent enough, you know where that's going, don't you? But nevertheless, he points out that enforcing these is going to be difficult because he's saying the same thing we heard from Victor Davis Hanson. A recent survey of Gallup finds that less than half of Americans said that they are very likely to comply with shutdown orders. The country could turn into a police state to try to enforce these mandates to cancel economic activities and demands that citizens stay home. But what makes all of this talk about massive shutdowns so disturbing is, as he said, there's very little evidence that lockdowns slow the spread of the coronavirus. Even the World Health Organization concedes that such orders cannot curb the spread of the coronavirus. And again, it's back to the point that Victor Davis Hanson made a minute ago. When you don't know what to do, you might as well do this because that's been done before, but it's not really working. But again, it's why I appreciate Stephen Moore so much, because he says there is an effect on these lockdowns, and that is it will lead to bankruptcy for thousands of small businesses and millions of destroyed jobs. Every week with shutdowns could lead to about $250 billion in lost output. So that means we could lose $2 trillion over 2 months. It would also crush, he says, the spirit of Americans, leading to more isolation, suicides, drug overdoses, and domestic abuse. There's a far better strategy employed by many states to protect seniors, people who are severely overweight, and vulnerable medical populations. Those groups account for well over 90% of the deaths and severe coronavirus medical problems. It is certainly one thing to have backed the shutdowns 9 months ago when we had no idea if they would work, but to continue to promote this ideology over data flies in the face of public policy based on evidence that the left accuses the right of ignoring. Thought it was a good piece, and if you find yourself saying, yeah, I'd like to post that on my Facebook page or my Twitter feed, it is available on our website, pointofview.net. Also, in addition to the lockdowns, there's also the clampdown, and that gets me to the piece by Ben Shapiro. They want to shut you up. And he uses a very good example of somebody we just interviewed here on Point of View. Remember Abigail Shrier? She wrote the book Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. And she has found herself in a firestorm because obviously she was writing about this idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria. And so as a result, all sorts of individuals, for example, are telling Target, for example, to not even make the book available. And he points out this wasn't the first time Abigail Shrier faced controversy. When her book first came out months back, Amazon moved to prevent her from advertising it. Although you've got books stumping for hormone treatments for minors suffering from gender dysphoria. You have individuals, one a professor, University of California, Berkeley, no surprise, called for burning the book. You have the deputy director for transgender justice at the American Civil Liberties Union wants to stop the circulation of the book. And it used to be the ACLU was for free speech, but nevertheless, that's the case. Then Ben Shapiro moves from just her example to the fact that you have this email service called MailChimp, which I think a lot of us have used, by the way, which handles mass emails on behalf of organizations. Just the other day announced that it would no longer work with the Northern Virginia Tea Party, stating that they were passing on what they felt was misinformation because they were holding a rally calling for a vote recount. That was enough to put you on the wrong side of MailChimp. And then, of course, there are all sorts of people that have been attacking those who are leaving Twitter and Facebook. CNN, he talks about a little bit later here, was very critical of those who have left Twitter for Parler. In particular, Brian Stelter lamenting that people are going to get more and more into their echo chambers, which I love Ben Shapiro saying, which is somewhat ironic given the enormous echo chamber CNN represents. And the point he gets to at the end of his piece, which we've posted for you to read, is the goal here isn't a freer discussion. It's precisely the reverse. He says conservatives have known this for a long time. That's why they've had to operate using unconventional media such as talk radio and podcasting and startup websites. But he says the future of this country rests largely on a simple question. Will traditional liberals go along with the left? Again, he makes the distinction that we talk about here and that Dennis Prager has been on the program to talk about. The traditional liberal, that's Alan Dershowitz, that's Jonathan Turley, some of the people we've quoted favorably here on the program, say, wait a minute, I mean, I may be a liberal, but I still defend the right of both liberals and conservatives, secular people and Christians, to actually express their viewpoint. But the left says, no, you have to be silenced. Your views cannot even be allowed in the public arena. And so, again, he's asking, will traditional liberals go along with the left, which seeks to silence in order to achieve their favored policy prescriptions, or will they walk away from the left and choose instead to engage in open conversation with conservatives, trying to preserve freedom of thought and discussion, but risking the possibility that their favorite policies will become more difficult to achieve? And so he concludes by saying, the question remains unanswered for now, but time to answer it is running out. If we hope to have a country together moving forward, we better have an open conversation now. As we've pointed out before, a lot of this is happening really in the private sector. I have no doubt that a fair amount is going to happen through the government in light of some of the people that Joe Biden wants to put on his team, already those on his transition team. But it's also interesting that a lot of this is happening simply through some of the social media organs. And that's another reason why we have to pay attention to the fact that it's not just hard totalitarianism that we talked about before. It also could be called soft totalitarianism. But if nothing else, I think Ben Shapiro's got it right. They want to shut you up. And we're starting to see more and more examples. He starts with is one that we've talked about. We felt it was appropriate to talk with Abigail about her book, Irreversible Damage. And yet maybe now we're on the wrong side because everybody from Amazon to Target to the American Civil Liberties Union and various university professors all say that that is a dangerous book for actually doing the research. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and over the next 2 hours, we're going to be talking with 3 different guests. But at the same time, we're also going to give you an update on all sorts of issues in the news. So in just a few minutes, we'll be talking with Lysa Terkeurst, whose new book is Forgiving What You Can't Forget. Next hour, we'll spend some time briefly talking with Dr. Richard Land about the election and about the divided states of America. And we'll be ending with our good friend O.S. Hawkins, and he has a whole series of books in the Code series, you know, the Jesus Code, the Joshua Code, the Daniel Code, the Believer's Code. We'll be talking about his book, the Bible Code, and get into some of that. But let's give you an update kind of on what is happening in terms of the election recount. And very significantly now, you have 2 members of Congress that are actually calling for an investigation into the integrity of the 2020 election. That would be Representative Jim Jordan, who is the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, a Republican from Ohio, and then Representative James Comer, who is a Republican from Kentucky, and he's the ranking member of the House Oversight and Reform Committee, sent a letter to the leadership in the House demanding a congressional investigation into the integrity of the 2020 election. Now, that would seem appropriate, given all of the questions that we even surfaced yesterday in here'stheevidence.com. Posted that, and you can see the hundreds of stories there. Some are anecdotes, some are allegations, some are affidavits, some are more credible than others. But, okay, there's enough to at least start an investigation. After all, we had a very lengthy investigation into so-called Russian collusion on the thinnest of evidence. This would be the case. And I thought it was appropriate that the people that they addressed this to were the committee chairman and chairwoman of those 2 committees. That would be the Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler, Democrat from New York, and this one I thought was most interesting, Carolyn Maloney, who's a Democrat from New York, who is the chairwoman of the Oversight and Reform Committee. You might remember it was her primary, the 12th congressional race for the primary in New York, that had all sorts of allegations of fraud and all sorts of mischief and even some questions about how the ballots were handled, and eventually a judge had to step in. It almost became a congressional race that had to be rerun, very much like what happened in the 9th Congressional District of North Carolina a couple of years ago, where they had to literally run the race again because there was so much fraud in that particular case. And so, if nothing else, the Twitter posts that came out from the representative is the 2020 election was full of chaos. Congressional oversight is needed for the American people to have faith in the integrity of our election. And so we'll see where that goes. And just shortly before I went on the air, about an hour ago, we also have something that came from the American Association of Evangelicals. And that included a number of people that have signed this. It'd be Eric Metaxas, Michelle Bachmann, former member of Congress Bob McEwen, James Garlow, Kelly Monroe Kohlberg, and a number of others who have also called for an investigation of the election. And so that is maybe setting in motion the possibility to investigate what is taking place. And I think it brings us to the first article that I've posted on our website today. It's written by Jim Garrity. And what he starts by doing is quoting from somebody writing in City Journal, Guy Sorman, who points out that in South Korea, there's usually a high level of trust of government. He says the South Korean people may like or dislike their government, but they trust that it makes rational choices. These choices are well explained and well understood because South Koreans believe in scientific progress. And so the question is, why don't Americans trust their government? Oh, I think there's some pretty good reasons. Let's pick a fight with everybody here. We have the president who is suggesting, as he says here, that doctors are inflating the death count of the coronavirus because they want to make money. We have governors that have banned sales of paint, flooring, and gardening tools, have actually cited people for sitting in their cars watching the sunset, or we've had individuals that have been handcuffed because they were out on a paddleboard by themselves. And if that's not enough, it kind of brings us to another piece by Victor Davis Hanson, who is convinced that because many of our leaders have been engaged in breaking the rules, we may have what he calls massive civil disobedience, because there is kind of this need right now for governors and even leaders in Europe to say, we got to do something, so we'll have some more lockdowns. But the harsh reality is, as he points out, that many of these officials, and last night on Tucker Carlson, he began to mention some of those: House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, California Governor Gavin Newsom, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and all those who violated their own edicts. They go to their hairdressers, they put their kids in private schools, they go to restaurants. So they're asking the public to obey these edicts that they don't feel apply to themselves. When you apply that to protest all summer, we saw people out in the streets, no social distancing, no masks, no cleanser, no spraying, no screaming. And we even had, he said, health officials who signed a letter saying it's actually more deleterious to the health of certain groups not to protest than to risk the virus. And I think it brings us into what I've called kind of the chump effect. That was something, again, you come find in City Journal that was just recently, because for those of you in California, you're well aware of the fact that your governor, Gavin Newsom, was spotted in an upscale restaurant. I think they call it the French Laundry. And the argument was made, well, that was outside. Well, one woman actually took some pictures. They showed up on Fox 11 in Los Angeles. And you can see those pictures, and you can see they are not outside. They are not wearing masks. They are sitting shoulder to shoulder one another, violating every principle set forth by the governor. And so, again, the governor had to at least be a little bit contrite by saying, well, the spirit of what I'm preaching all the time was contradicted. I need to preach and practice, not just preach. Although one of the spokesmen actually went on and said, no, we were actually outside and we didn't violate any rules, which gets back to, don't believe your lying eyes, just believe what we tell you. And of course, this article goes on to remind us of the D.C. governor, Muriel Bowser, who violated her own rules by traveling to Delaware to congratulate the so-called president-elect Joe Biden, and violated her own travel advisory. Chicago's Lori Lightfoot, who is out enjoying the crowd, speaking without a mask following the presidential election. And this one goes into one which we haven't mentioned, and that is the Philadelphia Mayor Jim Kenney, who was called out, even though he's imposed a restriction on indoor dining in his city, was actually spotted at a Maryland restaurant. And he said, I know some are upset that I dined indoors in a restaurant in Maryland, but I felt the risk was low because they had few COVID-19 cases. And you are starting to see more and more individuals saying, why should I follow the rules when the rule breakers are doing just fine and the people that are setting the rules are breaking the rules? And so it's really one of those issues that I think is going to be a major issue. And I think Victor Davis Hanson is right. And that is quite likely we're going to start seeing that maybe a lot of people are going to engage in civil disobedience if we have some of these lockdowns. Next hour, we'll get into some of the other questions about the lockdowns, but we need to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about forgiveness right here on Point of View.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Back in 1996, Samuel Huntington wrote The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order. He predicted the current conflict between Islam and the West. In my book, Understanding Islam and Terrorism, I show how this clash of civilizations has had a profound impact on missions. In the past, countries that were closed to the gospel tended to be communist countries. Even so, there is still a significant amount of Christian growth in countries behind the Iron Curtain and Bamboo Curtain. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, many of these countries are now open to the gospel more than ever. Meanwhile, persecution of Christians remains in China. But a new phenomenon has emerged. Muslim countries are now the most resistant to the message of Christianity. Mission work is limited or even non-existent in many of these Muslim countries. This, I believe, represents the greatest challenge for missions in the 21st century, reaching the Muslim world for Christ. Samuel Huntington also predicted a growing conflict between Western universalism and Muslim militancy. In other words, the conflict is between liberal Western democracies and Muslim countries. This presents a major challenge for Christians trying to reach Muslims. When they see the West with its immorality and decadence, they reject it and Christianity. After all, they reason, these are Christian countries and this is what they produce. Therefore, we should be quick to point out, as Christians, we also disagree with much of what some of these countries produce. Whether we are missionaries overseas or missionaries in our backyard, we need to begin to understand the nature of Islam and bring the message of the gospel to the Muslims we meet. I believe Samuel Huntington is correct in his analysis, and we should begin to understand the changing world around us so that we can be more effective for Christ. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Our topic the rest of this hour will be the issue of forgiveness. And many times on this program, we've said, you really need to forgive individuals that have harmed you, if for no other reason, for your benefit. But how do we go about forgiving? And especially, how can we forgive what you can't forget, which is the title of this new book. Well, 14 different chapters, 250 pages, written by certainly written by Lysa Terkeurst, and also published by Thomas Nelson. Forgiving what you can't forget, discover how to move on, make peace with painful memories, and create a life that's beautiful again. Lysa, if you're not familiar, is the president of Proverbs 13 Ministries, and you may be familiar with her best-selling book, It's Not Supposed to Be This Way, but this one takes you one step further and really addresses this issue of forgiveness and help you begin to think through what you can do to address an issue of pain and hurt in your life and to really apply a biblical principle of forgiveness. After all, the Bible calls for us to do so, but most of us have never been taught on how to do so. So, Lysa, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be with you.
You certainly study the Bible, and I have read that you probably invested more than 1,000 hours in a study of forgiveness. But this wasn't just sort of a vicarious experience. It was a personal experience, which I suspect many of our listeners probably are familiar with. But in case they aren't, can you tell us a little bit of the backstory?
Absolutely. So, my husband and I have been married over 2.5 decades, and I've always felt like we had a really good marriage and established a really healthy relationship, but, there were definitely things that went unattended for a little while in terms of just those deeper connections. And then probably we should have gone to counseling way before we did. And unfortunately, I found out my husband was being unfaithful. And I wasn't just shocked. I was completely shattered by it. But I was very determined right from the beginning to not make light of my pain and to not ignore my pain. I knew it was going to be important for me to deal with the pain that I was suffering. And so when I did that and got some help from a counselor, one of the first days that I walked into his office, he said, Lysa, I think, if you want to heal from this, I think today's a good day to start working on forgiveness. And I thought, are you crazy? It's way too soon for forgiveness. At that point, Art hadn't said he was sorry, nor was he even acknowledging that what he did was wrong. I mean, it was a very tough season. We weren't doing life together at that point. We were separated, and it did not look like our relationship was going to get back together. And I had so much confusion around forgiveness, especially thinking when reconciliation isn't possible, then maybe forgiveness isn't possible. So I spent over 1,000 hours studying forgiveness, but I'll be honest with you, as I studied forgiveness in the Bible, I was looking for a loophole. I was looking for God to say, there are some things you don't have to forgive, and I didn't find that. But what I did find is that forgiveness is actually a beautiful gift from God. Not an unfair gift that we give to the person who hurt us, but a beautiful gift we receive from God in order to help our hurting hearts heal.
And again, you were talking about the pain, because one thing you say in the book is the more our pain consumes us, the more it will control us. But you also go on to talk about the fact that those who cooperate most fully with forgiveness are those who, if nothing else, are able to really experience this idea of redemption. And I thought one other part of your backstory, which I found out a little bit later in the book, was this idea that you had been hurt by other men, and there was a sense in which, I'm not going to open myself up to any man, but then you decided to open yourself up to your husband, Art. And that is something I think would connect with a number of our listeners, because we've done programs on domestic abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, and things like that. There are a lot of women listening right now that say, I have a real difficult time relating to any man, and I'm not necessarily going to let down my barriers. And in some respects, that's why the pain was so great, I think, if I'm reading into your book effectively, because you actually lowered the barriers for a person you thought you could trust, and then the trust was broken.
That's right. And sometimes it can feel like if we resent those that hurt us, that resentment can almost help protect us. But what we don't realize is resentment is a false sense of protection. It just makes us closed off so that we don't experience love in other places. And resentment doesn't just want to keep us at arm's length from the people that hurt us. Resentment wants to turn us into somebody that we aren't. So it was really doubly hurtful for me when I did love deeply. I got hurt deeply, but it's not an indication that all relationships are going to be that way. And it's definitely not an indication that we're somehow damaged and we can't find a relationship that's good. I think when we love deeply and we hurt deeply, it actually increases our capacity to become people who are safe and vulnerable in relationships as long as we do our healing work.
Early on in the book, you talk about welcome to the table, and you said you wrote this message when you were sitting at a gray wooden table because it really kind of sets down some of the resistance that you or anybody else would have to even consider this idea of forgiveness, because as you said, when you met with a counselor, forgiveness, this is way too soon. But there is a real sense of barrier for a lot of individuals, male and female, to say, I'm not so sure, because then I might be taken advantage again. I might be hurt again. We'll get into the issue of boundaries, which you talk about later in the book. But that's an important issue where you talk about welcome to the table, right?
That's right. The whole time that I was writing this, I would have some of my staff members come and sit at the gray table, and I would read different parts of the book, and we would process it. We would process our skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
We would process our resistance to forgiveness. It was really important to me that I remember when you talk about forgiveness, you're often touching on some of the deepest pain that people have ever walked through, and telling them they have to forgive the person that hurt them can be so hard. So when my staff would gather, I would always have an empty chair, and that empty chair represented the reader that would one day read this book. And it was so important for me to look over at that chair and remember that this reader has been through some really hard stuff. And as I talk about forgiveness, I need to do so with the utmost tenderness, and I need to write it with the angst that a message like this deserves. And I couldn't start the book with a demanding notion of we have to forgive because that's the right thing to do. That would be a terrible thing to do the reader. I couldn't do that in the middle of my pain, and I wouldn't do that to my reader either. We had to start with my pain and the reader's pain, and that's where they are when they pick up a book, especially one on forgiveness.
Well, and you have a couple of those questions, so let's maybe pick off one of those, and then we'll maybe take a break and come back and pick off another one. But is this even survivable? Because if you are in the midst of that pain, it doesn't seem like there is any way out, and whether or not I'm even going to come out on the other side.
Well, that's right. And I think sometimes when we're asking this question, is this even survivable? What we're really asking is, how long is it going to hurt this much? And, my heart goes out to anyone that's been hurt, but especially for people who have been betrayed by a loved one or walked through the treacherous roads of infidelity. It is really, really hard, and it's really horrific, but I am living proof that it is survivable. I think we have to remember that our words frame our reality. And so when we talk about it, we can't say, when am I going to get over this? But rather, how can I move through this? And the only way out is through. And it is a process. And that's why in Forgiving What You Can't Forget, I talk about how forgiveness is a decision, but it's also a process of emotional healing. And the process of emotional healing is crucial.
We will continue our conversation. The book is entitled Forgiving What You Can't Forget. You can no doubt find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link to Lisa's website. We also have information that we have where you can get it in hardback or Kindle. And when we come back, we'll talk about another one of those questions. How is forgiveness even possible when I feel like this? Then a whole series of chapters on connecting the dots. But then what about this idea of boundaries? We've talked about that before with John Townsend and Henry Cloud and others, and just the whole idea of not only forgiving the person who has offended you or hurt you, but how about forgiving God, and where does that fit in? And what about this issue of bitterness? So we have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Lysa Terkeurst. And again, the book is entitled Forgiving What You Can't Forget. 250 pages, published by Thomas Nelson. Discover how to move on, make peace with painful memories, and create a life that's beautiful again. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link to her website and also, of course, information about this book as well. And so, Lysa, if we can focus on one of those other questions. How is forgiveness even possible when I feel like this? For some of our listeners right now, they're dealing with some pain, maybe some unforgiveness that's in their life or a recent hurt. And they're saying, yeah, how can I even think about forgiveness when I'm feeling all this pain right now?
Well, that's such an understandable question. And I always tell people you have to start by fully acknowledging the pain that you've been through. One of the best things my counselor did to me when he told me that in order to heal that I needed to start working on forgiveness. And I was so caught up in the pain that I was in. I just thought he was crazy. I just said, there's no way that I can be hurting this much and work on forgiveness. That just doesn't seem reasonable. But that's where he helped me understand that forgiveness is both a decision and a process. We make the decision to forgive for the facts of what happened. And in order to do that, we have to get all of the facts written out. So he handed me 3x5 cards and said, write out all of your pain, all the ways you've been hurt, write all the facts of what happened, one thing on each card. And when I did that with the situation with my marriage, I wound up having like 30 to 40 cards laying on the floor of his office. There was so much pain, but he did the most wonderful thing. My counselor looked at me and just said, Lysa, I believe you. And what happened to you was really, really hard and really awful, and it should not have happened. And I guess I just want to say to that listener today who has never had another person dare to bear witness to your pain, I want to do that for you today. And I want to say, I believe you, and what happened to you should not have happened. And I am so sorry that you have experienced all of this trauma, all of this hurt, all of this betrayal, all of this wounding. And I just want to say to you, I'm sorry. But I also want to say to you, you deserve to stop suffering because of what other people have done to you. And today, it is possible for you to do some forgiveness work for yourself. It doesn't have to be an unfair gift that you give to that person that hurt you. It can absolutely be a gift that you receive from God to help your heart start healing.
You know, your idea of the 3x5 cards and then needing to forgive Art for filling in also relates to something you say later in the book, and that is we really can't see in our hearts, but we can hear what we say. And so in some respects, when you, in the midst of some pain, blurt something out and say, I didn't even know that was in there, or when you are forced to fill out 3x5 cards, you go, ooh, I guess I didn't even know that was in there. There's a sense in which it kind of brings us to the 3 chapters you have there on Connect the Dots, because you have to sort of figure out the dots in your own life and then figure out how those dots relate to the people around you. Speak to that if you might.
Absolutely. Well, so much about our life experience is not just the story we live, but even more importantly, it's the story we tell ourselves. And it's that narrative that takes the experiences we walk through and the story that we then tell ourselves changes and can sometimes taint the perceptions that we have about ourselves, others, and even God. And whatever those perceptions that we start to form about ourselves, others, and God, that turns into a belief system that then affects everything else that we see. And so it can become a real vicious cycle. If we believe that we're not lovable because of an experience that we have, and that's the story that we tell ourselves, then every other experience we have gets filtered through that tainted belief. If we believe that other people aren't safe, then every experience we have gets tainted through that belief. So I think it's really important that we start doing what I help walk people through in my book, Forgiving What You Can't Forget, and that is connecting the dots of our story has to first start with collecting. So we collect the dots of our story. In other words, we collect the experiences that shaped our perceptions and our beliefs, and we look at them, and then we start to connect. Oh, this is why I felt this way, and this is why I felt that way. And, oh, I can see now where this perception about the world, about God, about myself, about others was formed. And then we do the healing work of correcting the dots. And that's where we start to correct some of those maybe tainted beliefs that are really holding us back from healing.
And again, one of the things I appreciate about your book is you also take on the tendency for some of us to use the wrong solutions. I don't need to run away. I don't need to isolate. I don't need to numb it away, and a number of others, because in some respects you have to face it on the very significant set of circumstances that you have. And so that brings us to a part about what you talk about, how unchangeable feels unforgivable. Again, you tell some incredible stories there about your life, but it really also gets into a positive, and that is forgiveness is more satisfying than revenge. Sometimes you just want to get back at the person who abused you, get back at the person who betrayed you, get back at the person who ruined your life. But revenge is not as sweet as you might think from some of the Hollywood movies that have actually promoted it, would we?
Well, that's right. I think revenge feels good. Like the thought of it feels good in the short term, but in the long term, it'll start to turn us into somebody that we never wanted to be. And really, revenge is allowing the person that hurt us to hurt us twice. In other words, they hurt us at the time of the incident, and then now their pain that they caused has gotten down into us and turned into versions of hate, and it's not who we want to be. And so I think this is where we have to recognize, like I was saying before, that forgiveness is both a decision. You know, we make the decision to forgive those who've hurt us, but we also must work through the process. When we make the decision to forgive, we forgive for the facts of what happened. But we then must also walk through the process of forgiveness, which is forgiving for the impact that that had on us, fully acknowledging the emotional devastation that we walked through and our own need for healing. Everything is fact and impact. So every fact of what happens to us has an impact of how much that cost us emotionally. And we can forgive. Making that decision to forgive can happen in a moment, a marked moment of time. But the process of forgiveness, forgiving for the impact, what this did to us or how much it cost us, that may last a lifetime.
Lysa, we can also, just before we take another break, talk about boundaries, because that is so important. There are boundaries and then there are walls, but you, again, talk about what you can and should do, because sometimes an individual still is in your life or can affect your life through social media, or is somebody in church or in family. So boundaries is a very important issue, because indeed, if somebody has hurt you before, they might again. And so, matter of fact, there's more likelihood that they will again. So this whole chapter of boundaries is very crucial as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. And we have to remember that boundaries are not a sign of unforgiveness. As a matter of fact, I think boundaries are important so we can live out Jesus' principle of forgiving 70 times 7. You know, it's impossible to control what another person does or says. And so I think when Jesus told us to forgive 70 times 7, he is not saying keep putting yourself in a position to get traumatized or abused or hurt in some way by another person. So the only way for us to properly live out the possibility of forgiving someone 70 times 7 that we have enough boundaries to create emotional safe distance in us so that the other person doesn't traumatize us. And when we create those emotional safe distances and those boundaries, you remember a boundary is not to shove another person away, it's to hold me together. So I create enough space there that if that person does not change their behavior, then I can keep doing life in an emotional, healthy way, and I can keep forgiving them as long as there are boundaries to protect me.
Let's take a break, and I might just mention when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about some of the other resources from Proverbs 31 Ministries, some of the resources. There is a DVD, free streaming access, a study guide, and some of the rest. But we also want to talk about what about this relationship to God, because they thought God would save them. And not only do we talk about forgiving the person who has offended you or hurt you, but how about this idea of forgiving God? So we'll get back to those conversations as we continue our conversation about forgiving what you can't forget right after these messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Lysa Terkeurst, and as we talk about the book, Forgiving What You Can't Forget. And Lysa, just before we get back to the book, let's talk about what is available. You are the president of Proverbs 31 Ministries, and some individuals listening to this might not only want to get a copy of the book, but would like to teach it or would like to go through a group with it. Maybe there are some other resources. So talk about what is available through Proverbs 31 Ministries, because you have a number of free resources on the beauty of forgiveness. And then there are all sorts of material that you can obtain, which includes the study guide, the DVD, and a variety of others. So what is available to our listeners today?
Absolutely. Well, if you go to forgivingwhatyoucan'tforget.com, you can find all of those free resources and also all of the companion products that are available. Or you can go to proverbs31.org and check out our Therapy and Theology podcast series. I think that will give listeners so many good free resources as well.
So again, the great resources available to some of our listeners, and so we'll certainly talk about that. And let's, if we can, get into two of our chapters, which I'm glad you included, because one, because they thought God would save them. Where was God when this happened? If he's all powerful, why couldn't he have stopped that? And then the whole issue of forgiving God. Those are two chapters which I want to put together because they relate to some of the kinds of questions that people run into.
That's right. I think, sometimes when we're deeply hurt, wounded, and betrayed by other people, it's hard for us to reconcile that God saw this coming and he didn't stop it. And if we serve an all-knowing, loving Father, Heavenly Father, then how could he have let us get hurt so deeply? And, it is really hard to reconcile that. But here's what I have to say that I have learned. We don't serve a do-nothing God. God is always doing something. And I remember when I was going through so much of this healing process that I had to work through, I was having my house renovated. And one day, some men came into my kitchen with sledgehammers, and they demolished the kitchen. They tore down the cabinets and broke the countertops and smashed the windows. And I remember standing there that day, and I thought, isn't it amazing that I'm standing in the middle of devastation, but because I trust the builder, I'm not feeling traumatized at all. But if I didn't know that this was for a remodel project, this could be one of the most traumatizing days of my entire life. And I just thought, this is really where I need to trust that God is a master builder, and he will not let things just get devastated in our life. He will renovate our life, but sometimes things have to be torn apart before they can be put back together beautifully. And I don't say that flippantly, and I don't say that in any kind of way to tie up the hard and horrific things we walk through in a neat, nice bow. I just say it to give some perspective that God is good at being God. I don't understand why he allows us to go through some of the things that we go through. But what I do know is that God does love us, and he is doing something, even if we don't understand it and can't see a good outcome yet. We just have to walk through the process of trusting God and staying close to him. Our job is just to be obedient to God in the process, and his job is everything else.
Again, very difficult to answer easily, and of course we're not trying to be flippant at all or cavalier, but at the same time, sometimes we don't see the full picture until much later. But one other chapter that I thought would be worth mentioning is the one on bitterness. You call that a bad deal that makes big promises. Sometimes individuals we run into hold on to their bitterness because in some respects that brings resolution for them, but it's really not the kind of deal that you want to make, is it?
That's right. Bitterness doesn't just want to be a feeling. Bitterness wants to become our only feeling. Bitterness wants to take over inside of us and then leak out from us and affect everyone that it touches. And so, one thing when I talk about bitterness, though, is I'm very careful to say there is a blessing of bitterness. Now, this may seem really strange, but hang with me here. You see, I think sometimes we say, oh, someone's experiencing bitterness, and they must have a cold, hard heart. The blessing of bitterness is that actually proves the exact opposite. Bitterness doesn't often visit cold, hard hearts. Bitterness often moves in to the losses that people experience who have really tender, beautiful hearts. And because they loved deep, they got hurt deeply. When we throw our arms open wide and embrace love with everything we've got, and then we're hurt or betrayed, it's only natural to see that bitterness comes in. And at first, those resentments kind of feel like they're protecting us. But over time, if we don't tend to them, I say in the book, when hurt sits in the human heart too long unattended, it actually starts turning into all kinds of versions of hate. And I just want to say, your heart is much too beautiful of a place for bitterness, anger, resentments, or unforgiveness.
Just before I let you go, we have a link to your website. Let's talk about what's available there, because people can follow the podcast on a variety of different issues. They can get a copy of the book. They can find out where you're going to be speaking. They can schedule you to speak as well. So what will they find when they land on your website?
Absolutely. Well, my personal website is lysaterkeurst.com, which is kind of complicated. So if you just put in your Google search Lysa, capital T, for Terkeurst, then hopefully it'll pop right up. But lysaterkeurst.com, there you can find links to the Proverbs 31 site. You can find out how to purchase the book. You can also find out about some of our free downloadable resources. We've done a beautiful resource for people on boundaries and also some things on forgiveness. And you can find out how to get over to our Therapy and Theology podcast, which is really, really helpful. That's a free resource. You have to purchase the books and the companion products, but the other downloadables are free, and certainly the podcast is free as well.
I might just mention, too, that if you don't know how to spell her last name, and I'm sure she's had to spell it many, many times, it is on our website. Simply go to pointofview.net. You will see her picture and then click on the website. Of course, we also have information about the book. I know most of you probably will find the book in your local bookstore, but if you're not located where there is a bookstore or that book's not there, we have also provided a link to both hardcover and Kindle. And Lysa, appreciate you being so vulnerable to share your story, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
We are going to take a break, and when we come back, I'm going to get into a couple of issues in the news. There's some things we haven't covered here as well. You can see some of those articles we've posted on the website. Then we're going to talk with Dr. Richard Land, and what about this divided America? It's not a surprise that we ended up divided over the election. Where do we go from here? And then we have our good friend O.S. Hawkins, as we've talked about so many of the code book series. This is the most recent one called the Bible Code. I think you will enjoy that as well. So we have a lot to cover. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about any one of the three guests we're talking about today, that information is on our website. If you'd like to find some of the articles, the one I mentioned just last hour was on Americans Don't Trust the Government. Also one that I will get to at the top of the hour here, Ben Shapiro, they want to shut you up. And then also, what about this lockdown? What are the costs? And again, our friend Stephen Moore has done some work on that. And so it's just a reminder of what we may be headed for in the future. Many of the governors talking about a lockdown. Individual that at the moment is being called the president-elect, Joe Biden, wants a national lockdown. So we want to look at this issue of lockdown. No matter what the election does, we have to pay some attention to what's going to happen in the future, and we will do that right after these important messages.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I've recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to get back into some of the issues in the news, and then in about 15 minutes, we're going to be talking with Dr. Richard Land, president of the Southern Evangelical Seminary. He, a number of years ago, wrote a very powerful and kind of prophetic book, The Divided States of America. In light of this election, what is the future? He also has a piece that came out in Christian Post about kind of looking ahead to what's next for our country. So we're going to spend some time briefly talking with him about that. Then O.S. Hawkins will be with us. We'll be talking about his latest book in the Code series. You got the Jesus Code, the Joshua Code, the Daniel Code, the Believer's Code. This one's called the Bible Code, and I think you will appreciate that. But just before we get to all of that, let me look at two of the articles we've posted on the website for you to read. The first on the lockdown. The second on kind of the intellectual shutdown. They are in some respects related, but different. The lockdown is something written by Stephen Moore. He, of course, is an economist and has looked at these issues for some time. And he talks about what he calls the return of the lockdown lunacy. He says, in wake of rising numbers of coronavirus cases and hospitalizations, as many states, notably those run by Democrats, are going towards economic lockdowns. And he talks about states like New York, Illinois, Virginia, Michigan, Maryland, Minnesota, California, and Washington. And those like California and Washington have considered full lockdowns. That, he says, means lockdowns of schools, churches, businesses, restaurants, office buildings. And even the California governor, Gavin Newsom, issued orders on how to celebrate Thanksgiving with no singing, no laughing, no more than 10 people at the table. And, of course, he raises some important questions. One of those is, who thinks of these unrealistic edicts? Much more worrisome, he says, than this discussion is what is happening now in the discussions taking place in the transition team of Joe Biden, who are considering a national lockdown that could last for several weeks. One of the quotes that Stephen Moore gives us is a kind of a summary, if you will, of some comments by Michael Oversholm, who is at University of Minnesota, who said he really wanted a suspension of economic activities before the backlash and broad alarm about the effects of his recommendation might affect the administration, because he and other advisors to Joe Biden in the transition team basically are arguing that the last time we had a national lockdown in the spring, remember that? They're convinced that it didn't work because it was not stringent enough. And as Stephen Moore says, what more do they want from us? Well, it brings us back to something I talked about last hour, and it was quoted by Victor Davis Hanson, who points out that there are many people that look like they might exercise civil disobedience. And Stephen Moore gives us a quote here from a survey done by Gallup, which concluded that less than half of Americans said that they were very likely to comply with shutdown orders. And the only way you could do that would be to almost turn this country into a police state, to enforce mandates to cancel economic activities and demand that citizens stay at home. What makes, he says, all of these talk about massive shutdowns so disturbing is there's very little evidence that lockdowns slow the spread of the coronavirus. Even the World Health Organization concedes that some orders cannot curb the spread of the coronavirus. And that is something we've talked about on this program. You might remember the interview that we did, matter of fact, during this hour just a few weeks ago with Dr. Jay Richards, who wrote a book on the subject along with Doug Axe and William Briggs and a number of others, in which they looked at the effect of these lockdowns, and the effect was very insignificant. They started with the assumption that really you need to do kind of a cost benefit, and that maybe there would be some slight benefit, but they're the enormous cost, which I'm going to mention in just a minute from Stephen Moore. If you go and look at their book and look at the graphs they have for all these different states, at least more than a dozen states, you can see that they have marked where the lockdown begins. Then you go ahead 10 to 15 days, maybe 14 days, and you don't see much of an impact. So the cost benefit is an enormous cost for virtually no benefit. And that brings me back to the piece here by Stephen Moore, because he says the effect of the lockdowns is bankruptcy for thousands of small businesses and millions of destroyed jobs. Every week with shutdowns could lead to about $250 billion in lost output. So that means we would lose $12 trillion over 2 months. It would also, as he points out, crush the spirit of Americans, leading to more isolation, more suicides, more drug overdoses, more domestic abuse. He says a far better strategy employed by many states is to protect seniors, people who are severely overweight, and vulnerable medical populations. These groups account for well over 90% of the deaths and severe coronavirus medical problems. It is certainly one thing to have backed the shutdowns 9 months ago when we had no idea if they would work, but to continue to promote, he says, ideology over data flies in the face of public policy based upon evidence that the left accuses the right of ignoring. So that's the question of the lockdown. But the other one that's on the horizon is the question of the shutdown, and that is the shutdown of any kind of intellectual discussion. And that brings us to the piece by Ben Shapiro, in which he starts by talking about Abigail Shrier, who you might remember was on this program, author of the book Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. And she, of course, has found herself in a firestorm. There have been individuals that have wanted to prevent her book from getting published. Matter of fact, just when the book first came out, Amazon moved to keep her from advertising the book. Although the book, interestingly enough, deals with gender dysphoria, Amazon did not ban any of the advertisements for hormone treatment for minors suffering from gender dysphoria. You have one professor, University of California at Berkeley, no surprise there, called for burning the book. You have the deputy director of transgender justice at the American Civil Liberties Union, who wants to completely stop the publication of the book. And then Ben Shapiro moves on from there to talk about other examples, one of which I'll mention is the email service MailChimp, which handles all sorts of mass emails for various organizations, but it announced that it would not allow the Northern Virginia Tea Party to actually use their service because they were spreading potential misinformation. Actually, the misinformation was they were holding a rally calling for a vote recount, but that was enough of an offense to simply remove them. And so he says, the goal in each one of these cases, and he gives quite a few, isn't freer discussion. It's precisely the reverse. He says conservatives have known this for a long time, which is why they've had to operate using unconventional media like talk radio and podcasting and startup websites. But the real question is, will traditional liberals go along with the left, which seeks to silence in order to achieve their favored policy prescriptions? Your typical liberal, like Alan Dershowitz, who we've had on the program, or Jonathan Turley, we mentioned the other day, believes that both liberals and conservatives should have free speech. The left doesn't believe that, and it's really a very good question that Ben Shapiro raises in this column, and it's on our website, pointofview.net. Let's come back, and Dr. Richard Land has been looking at the election, looking at the division in America, and thinking about what we need to do in the future. So we'll talk with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Back in 1996, Samuel Huntington wrote The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order. He predicted the current conflict between Islam and the West. In my book, Understanding Islam and Terrorism, I show how this clash of civilizations has had a profound impact on missions. In the past, countries that were close to the gospel tended to be communist countries. Even so, there is still a significant amount of Christian growth in countries behind the Iron Curtain and Bamboo Curtain. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, many of these countries are now open to the gospel more than ever. Meanwhile, persecution of Christians remains in China. But a new phenomenon has emerged. Muslim countries are now the most resistant to the message of Christianity. Mission work is limited or even non-existent in many of these Muslim countries. This, I believe, represents the greatest challenge for missions in the 21st century, reaching the Muslim world for Christ. Samuel Huntington also predicted a growing conflict between Western universalism and Muslim militancy. In other words, the conflict is between liberal Western democracies and Muslim countries. This presents a major challenge for Christians trying to reach Muslims. When they see the West with its immorality and decadence, they reject it and Christianity. After all, they reason, these are Christian countries and this is what they produce. Therefore, we should be quick to point out, as Christians, we also disagree with much of what some of these countries produce. Whether we are missionaries overseas or missionaries in our backyard, we need to begin to understand the nature of Islam and bring the message of the gospel to the Muslims we meet. I believe Samuel Huntington is correct in his analysis, and we should begin to understand the changing world around us so that we can be more effective for Christ. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we are going to now spend some time talking with Dr. Richard Land. He's the president of the Southern Evangelical Seminary, also serving right now as the executive editor of the Christian Post, which is a great place to find some great articles as well. Has, of course, his Doctor of Philosophy degree from Oxford University. Of course, is at Southern Evangelical Seminary, but in the past was the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is part of the Southern Baptist Convention. And also one of the books we posted, it came out many years ago, but it kind of relates exactly to what we're going to be talking about. His book, The Divided States of America, What Liberals and Conservatives Are Missing in the God and Country Shouting Match. And Dr. Richard Land, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. We'll get to him in just a minute. And when we do so, we'll talk about some of those changes. I just had everybody wave me off here. I thought we had him on, and certainly we'll get him in just a minute. And one of the things he's been talking about here is that when we see what is unfolding right now in the election, what's been kind of interesting is the, if you will, realization of some of the prophetic statements he was making in that book years ago, The Divided States of America. He said, what I feared would happen in the 2020 presidential election has happened. And no, I'm not talking about whether Joe Biden or Donald Trump would win. I'm referencing the divisive and ambiguous situation we face as a nation, where neither candidate has a clear victory or a mandate, and where there has been widespread reports of loss of ballot integrity. And he points out that really one of the great challenges is that whoever prevails, at least the half of the nation is going to really feel disenfranchised and exploited. And we now are joined by Dr. Richard Land. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, Kerby, how are you?
I am good. And I mentioned your book, The Divided States of America. You wrote that years ago, but in some respects, what you were talking about then has been prophetic because we just keep seeing these elections where we have a nation that is divided. And no matter what happens, at least half of the country is going to be upset and disappointed and maybe even start protesting. What's your thoughts?
Well, yeah, unfortunately, I've seldom been more disappointed than saddened to be right. Yeah, we live in a very closely divided country, and that's reflected in our elections. And when there is widespread belief that it wasn't an honest election, and it's this close, at least half the country is going to feel disenfranchised, and they're going to feel like the president is not a legitimate president. And I think that whatever the outcome is now to this election, that's baked into the cake. For the next 4 years, whoever is president is going to have to deal with the fact that at least half the country does not believe he's the duly elected president. And that's very problematic for our country and for the governors of our country. But I'm not sure what you do about it except having more transparent and honest elections.
And again, one of the issues that maybe we would bring up is how long that might last, because we've been through essentially 4 years where a lot of people have said that Donald Trump's election was illegitimate, and whether it was the Russian collusion or now whether it, if indeed Joe Biden becomes the president, it's the question about what was happening in some of these swing states. At least I hope, and some people have been asking me off air, do you think this is going to last for 4 years like the other one lasted 4 years? I'd like to know what you might think about that.
I think it's going to last at least 2. If, for instance, if there is evidence that emerges over the next 2 years that contradicts the election results, that could result in an overwhelming wave for the other party in the midterm elections. And I think that at that point, the division would start to dissipate in that it would become much more difficult for the president in office to continue to do much other than just fill the office. If you had a veto-proof majority, for instance, in the House or in the Senate, the president is effectively neutered politically. And that would be a way of the people expressing their unhappiness with the president. I don't think anybody's got the stomach for another impeachment unless it was shown that the president was involved in the chicanery in the electoral process.
In just a minute, I want to get to your piece that was in the Christian Post about what happens in the future. But since you were talking about that, when we talk about veto proof, right now we are seeing 2 very important U.S. Senate runoff elections that will happen in Georgia. We have a significant number of our listeners that live in Georgia, and they are no doubt going to be pummeled with every kind of television ad. There's going to be an enormous amount of money that was spent. And given the fact they spent, $108 million to try to defeat Lindsey Graham and about $90 million to defeat Mitch McConnell, I'm thinking that a lot of money, time, and effort is going to be pouring into Georgia. But what's at stake there?
Well, what's at stake there is whether or not there are any checks on presidential power. If the Democrats win those 2 runoffs, they will have 50 seats in the Senate, and with Kamala Harris breaking the tie as vice president, they can organize the Senate so all the chairmanships will be Democrats. You'll have really radical Democratic senators as chairman of the Appropriations Committee, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and the president. If, for instance, at that point, they could vote by majority vote to eliminate the filibuster, which means that 50 votes plus 1, you can pass anything in the Senate. Whereas historically, it's often been said the House is the cup of coffee, and the Senate is where the coffee gets poured into a saucer to cool and to have reflection over whether it's good legislation. And the filibuster rule really does, if it requires a 2/3 majority, then you have to have compromise. You have to have negotiation. and the minority does get to have some say. But they could do away with the filibuster, which means 50+1 rules. They could admit 2 extra states, D.C. and Puerto Rico, and give Democrats 4 extra senators in perpetuity. They could add 6 justices to the Supreme Court, and thus immediately making the Supreme Court liberal and diluting the current conservative majority. They can do just about what they want to.
Wow. And again, it shows the significance of that. We're going to continue focusing on Georgia. But again, as the editor, one of the editors, executive editor of the Christian Post, you posted a piece the other day, Where We Go From Here. And it does seem to me that as Christians, we should be talking about praying for, you say, peace, reconciliation, and resolution. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, it does the country no good to have the kind of division we've had. And I think that what we've had the last 4 years could be minor compared to what we get if half the people do not think that the president is a duly elected president, then that's a recipe for mayhem. It's a recipe for division and for opening up wounds in the body politic that are going to be a lot easier to open than they're going to be to heal. So I think we need to work as Americans for full transparency in the election process. I think Americans deserve to know whether their votes counted and whether we had an honest election. I have my doubts, but I'm open to evidence. I feel like that the first clue that this is going to be a massively dishonest election was that the Democrats have been pushing hard for mail-in ballots long before COVID came along.
Mm-hmm.
When Nancy Pelosi took over control of the House after the 2018 elections, the first bill she filed, H.R. 1, was on expanding the rules for mail-in balloting. And we're not talking about absentee votes here. We're talking about sending ballots unsolicited to registered voters. At least at one point, there were registered voters in a state. And you got millions of loose ballots out there that are so easy to counterfeit. And some of us have been saying for months and months that this is a recipe for a catastrophe. Bill Barr said it was like playing Russian roulette with the democratic process.
Yes,
and I think that's a very accurate description. And I think in some states it was seriously corrupted.
Dr. Richard Land with us, and just before we go, let me mention we have a link to drrichardland.com, and also you have this commentary, Bringing Every Thought Captive. So if people would like to see the podcast and get some of the archives, we have a link to that, and I certainly appreciate you giving us some time today.
Well, thank you, Kerby. Also, have them check out ses.edu, which is our seminary, and we offer bachelor's, master's, and doctoral level courses in Christian apologetics, and we'd love to have them take a look at it.
Again, Southern Evangelical Seminary, ses.edu. Dr. Richard Land, thank you for joining us. We'll be back right after this.
Bye-bye.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yeah, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, we're going to spend some time talking with our good friend Dr. O.S. Hawkins, who has served as a pastor at First Baptist Church in Fort Lauderdale and First Baptist Church in Dallas, but is the president of Guidestone Financial Resources. But we've had him on over these years to talk about his Code Series books, author of more than 30 books, but the Code Series just certainly have been incredibly outstanding. The Jesus Code, the Joshua Code, the Nehemiah Code, the Daniel Code, the Believer's Code, the James Code, the Passion Code, and the most recent one that I have in my hands here, the Bible Code, Finding Jesus in Every Book in the Bible. I love the books, but I also love the fact that the royalties and proceeds of the Code series go to Mission Dignity to reach out and to actually provide resources for those of individuals, especially many of them that served in small churches that were unable to provide adequately for their retirement. It's just a great resource that he has made available. And O.S. Hawkins, it is always a delight to have you on the program.
Thank you, Kerby, and it's always great to be with you, and I look forward to getting to be back in that studio for long and not just on the phone with you.
Well, that would be good because, as you know, I have the entire collection of code books, some of which I have been able to get because I was doing the interviews, but others I went out and bought because I think very highly of the fact that it goes to Mission Dignity. But before we get into this book, give us kind of an overview because it is oftentimes interesting to find out how these books developed and how each one of them focus on a different aspect of the Christian life. Can you kind of give us a brief overview?
Sure. Now, the word code, it's not a code in the sense that it's something mysterious, but the fact that that's a secret there. It's a code in the sense that it unlocks the truth of the Word of God to us. It's really these code books, when I wrote them, began writing them, were not about trying to get people into the Word of God, but trying to get the Word of God into the readers. And you know that, Kerby, they began a few years ago when I began to realize that I was trying to get a new believer into the Bible, and even believers that have been walking for a while, they start reading the Bible, they start in Genesis, and if they get to Leviticus, it's a miracle, and then they get bogged down.
Yes.
If they start in Matthew, that they can't pronounce half the names in chapter 1 of that genealogy. So it dawned on me that there were some verses in the Bible that if people really knew those verses, memorized them, and applied the truth of their lives, they could know the theme of the Bible. And so I picked out 52 scripture verses I thought every believer ought to know. And I was devotionally reading through Joshua, and I saw there in Joshua 1:8, the Bible says, "This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night in order to do all that's written therein. Then you'll make your way prosperous. Then you'll have good success." And so we came up with the Joshua Code and those 52 scripture verses, and it just took off. A verse for every week of the year. You memorize one verse a week. There are Bible study materials there, devotional thoughts in it that guide you to the truth of that verse. And those 52 verses, you learn them and you memorize them, you'll know the Word of God. And it was so successful, and all the royalties do go to Mission Dignity, that then it dawned on me, I was reading the Gospels, and it dawned on me how many times Jesus asked questions. He was always asking questions. And so I came up with the Jesus Code, 52 scripture questions every believer ought to answer. You know, I believe there are 52 questions in the Bible that before we get to heaven, we need to answer. If a man dies, will they live again? What think you to Christ? Whose son is he? Who do you say that I am? On and on and on. And from there, Kerby, they just took off, and thank God we sold over 2 million copies of them now. All the royalties go to support those dear old pastors, and most of cases they're widows in their declining years, living near the poverty level. So we're just so grateful for everybody that's been a part of the Code series.
And again, one of the things that I've done is every time I have toast, I think about this, because you talk about the fact that because of mission dignity, there was one widow that said, maybe now I can have something other than just toast for dinner. And so it just is.
Kerby, she was 87, wrote me a few years ago. 10, 12 years ago, we were able to help these people with $50 a month, and that helped them. But now we've been able to raise so much money in mission dignity, and also supplemented by the royalties of all these books, that now the neediest of them get $630 a month. And
wow.
That little widow wrote me, and she said, I get to eat at night now, and it's not just a piece of toast. And that's what keeps me writing them, keeps me motivated from them, and because I know that every time someone purchases one or many of them, all the royalties go to help those precious people.
If you go to our website, pointofview.net, it has a link to oshawkins.com. You can also find out about his VIP book and some of these code books. And, of course, we've made it very easy for you to order it. No doubt you probably can find it in your local bookstore, published by our friends at Thomas Nelson. And I might just mention to you pastors, there is a section there for weekly staff meetings, because as a pastor and then, of course, the president of Guidestone, O.S. Hawkins shares some of the ideas and principles that will help you, especially if you're a young pastor and need some guidance from an individual that has certainly traveled down the road that you're traveling down and certainly learned some things that he can pass on to you. I think you will really benefit. So again, all of that is at oshawkins.com. Let's talk about this book, because in some respects what you're doing there is finding Jesus in every book of the Bible, 55 different chapters, so that you both through the Old Testament and the New Testament find Jesus. Of course, it's easy to find Jesus somewhat in the New Testament, but help us out with this in the Old Testament, because there are some places where you might see what is called a Christophany or something like that, but in other cases, the theme of Jesus is in the Old Testament. But how do we find that?
Well, Kerby, there's an analogy here. Most of us have an appendage that stays right by our side throughout all the daylight hours and not too far away, even when we're fast asleep. And we've developed such a dependency on this appendage that there's hardly a part of our lives in which it's not involved. And of course, I'm speaking of these smartphones. We talk on them, we text on them, we tweet on them, we schedule on them, we get our news from them, we do our banking on them, we pay our bills on them, we watch the weather on them, even awaken each day to an alarm on them. But one of the greatest features of them is the camera. In fact, I can take better pictures on the camera on my iPhone than I ever could with any camera I owned. And if you're like me, you've got thousands of pictures stored up on your phone, pictures of your kids, your grandkids, vacations, friends, scores of other pictures that are there. And we love showing pictures of our kids to others. And God does the same thing. He delights in the same thing. He loves showing us pictures of his son, the Lord Jesus. And that's exactly what he does in every book of the Bible. He shows us a picture of Jesus. And that's what we've done in the Bible Code. We've just looked at all of them. You remember on the, for example, in the Gospel of Luke, we say that he's the third man on the Emmaus Road. If you remember, after the crucifixion, the disciples were dejected, downtrodden, and Cleopas and that other one, living in Emmaus, were walking back home saying, we had hoped he had been the one, but they buried that hope in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. And all of a sudden, Christ came along beside them. And if you remember, he said, when their eyes were opened, it says, beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he began to expound to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. From Moses to Malachi, all through the Old Testament, he from the prophets to the Pentateuch to the prophets, he showed how he was in every book of the Bible. And that's basically what we do. Beginning back in Genesis, we see him as that lamb at Abraham's altar. He was the Passover lamb in Exodus, and on, such beautiful pictures of Christ.
And again, I'll take a break and we'll come back a little bit more. In Leviticus, he's the sweet-smelling aroma. In Numbers, he's the bronze serpent on Moses' pole. In Deuteronomy, he's the manna in the wilderness. And that just gives you a little bit of an idea of what you find in the Old Testament. Of course, in the Psalms, he is our shepherd. In the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, he's our wisdom. In the Song of Solomon, he's our bridegroom. But even in the New Testament, we, of course, would see him most clearly. He's the Christ and the Son of living God in Matthew. He's the God of the second touch in Mark. He is the third person, as we mentioned just a minute ago, on the Emmaus Road in Luke, and he's the resurrection and the life in John. So we'll come back and talk a little bit more about how to use these various books, and then we'll let O.S. Hawkins go on to his activities today, but also wanted you to know about Guidestone Financial Resources. When we come back, we're going to talk about that as well. It is a great place to consider your investments because they invest in biblically sound, ethically sound kinds of investments and have actually won awards for the kind of investments they do. So we'll talk a little bit about the code books, a little bit about Guidestone, and then we will wind down the program for today. All that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, Hawkins with us for just a few more minutes. And let's if we can, maybe focus on how to use these books, because this Bible code, 55 different chapters. Now, each one of the chapters is pretty short, anywhere from 4 to 6 pages, depending on which particular one. But in many cases, I know people that use these sort of as their daily devotional guide, but also there are just some, in many of your code books, some of the sermons that I've heard you preach over the years. So there are some material that is obviously devotional in nature, but some of it is certainly very good in terms of exegesis. So how would people be able to use these books in an effective way?
Yeah, they, in many ways, Kerby, and thanks for that question. In fact, there are over 500 actual sermon outlines and exegesis in these code series. But most of them are devotional. The Believer's Code is a 365-day devotional, a different verse every day and a different devotional thought every day. It's a daily devotional. The Joshua Code, the Jesus Code are geared to be year-long devotionals. We have the Christmas Code, which is an Advent devotional, takes you from December 1st to December 25th. And the Christmas Code, Kerby, sold over 500,000 copies last year alone.
Amazing.
So we're so blessed with that. Then we have the Easter Code that takes you from Ash Wednesday to Easter Sunday. And then after that, the Apostles' Code that takes you on a devotional journey from Easter to Pentecost Sunday on the Holy Spirit. So they're just designed for whatever your devotional journey may be to journey on it. Many of these people are just taking the Bible code and taking a chapter a day and using it as a devotional in that way. And, as you know, there's 66 books in the Bible. There are 55 chapters here because books like 1st and 2nd Kings we did as the books of Kings, and
right.
1st and 2nd Chronicles is Chronicles. So, but every book of the Bible is covered there.
And I might just mention, too, of course, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, all those in the New Testament.
Right.
And so some great resources there. Let me, for just a minute, move away from the code books, because we've promoted those, and we have a link to it in case somebody would like to purchase it. I would think they would be able to find it in their local bookstore. But I did mention, first of all, what is happening there at Guidestone. And we've always talked about that with you, because it is one of those issues that a number of Christians over the years, OS, have been concerned about. When I invest in this IRA or this 401k or whatever, I'm never quite sure how much of that money is going towards gambling, how much of that money ends up at Planned Parenthood. And you have had a real desire to do a biblically accurate as well as morally consistent kind of investment. And even as you've done that, God has really blessed you, because I know you've run awards for some of the investments that you've actually done.
Yes, Kerby. Guidestone Funds, it's the largest screened mutual fund in the world. We have $18 billion under our asset base right now, serving well over 250,000 different individuals with their investment needs. And yes, we don't invest in companies that are publicly recognized to be involved in alcohol, gambling, abortion, all those major pornography, those other things that are involved. And so we've proven that you can take your values into the marketplace and be successful. As you mentioned, we've won the #1 Mutual Fund of the Year award twice from Barron's and Wall Street Journal up in New York. And so we're very, very successful. People can go to guidestone.org and learn all about how you can invest at Guidestone Funds and know that you'll be investing properly, and also get a good return that's very competitive in the marketplace.
One last point I thought I would come back to, and that is you have that weekly staff meetings. I know that we have a number of pastors that listen to this program, as well as elders, deacons, Bible fellowship leaders. They can learn quite a bit from a few of us old gray-haired guys that have been in ministry for a while, and you pass on some of those insights to individuals. And so there is a way in which people can get access to that as well, can't they?
You're right. Everything except the code books, which support Mission Dignity, is free at oshawkins.com. There are hundreds of sermons there. There are videos. There are many free book downloads of my older books. In fact, for pastors, there's a my pastor's primer, that pastor's manual's over 400 pages. It's a free book download there at oshawkins.com. And that staff meeting, I put this website up there. It's been so successful because I just did it for pastors at the crossroads that needed resources. And so there are 26 10-minute staff meetings that a lot of those guys that I go to staff meeting with on these videos at oshawkins.com are there by themselves, bivocational pastors, or maybe they got a small staff around them and they go to these weekly staff meetings that are, it's all there at oshawkins.com and all free.
So again, appreciate you being on the program. Also, there's a link to Susie Hawkins, who's one of the great speakers as well, just an incredibly gifted family. And OS, it's always great to have you on the phone, but I'm looking forward to next time we can have you in studio and we can spend some time together talking. But it's been great to have you once again here on Point of View.
And Kerby, thank you for the standard you continue to raise up for everything that's good and godly. We love you. Thank God for you, and want to encourage all the people listening to support Point of View, because what you're doing is just absolutely needed, and God bless.
Thank you. Again, I'll hold up the book. It is called The Bible Code, and if you don't have a copy, I think you will enjoy it. And as you can see, it's just a beautiful copy of a book, and any one of these code books or any selection thereof certainly would make a great Christmas present. I know we're not thinking Christmas quite yet, but we're getting there, so I thought I'd mention that as well. O.S. Hawkins, a good friend, but we are coming down to the end of the program today. Tomorrow, we will have our weekend edition. Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford. He was just with the vice president. I think he was also in the president's company as well, but I know he's with the vice president, and so we'll get his update on some of the things happening there. And, of course, we'll give you an update on what is happening, for example, in Georgia. They've been doing a recount, and first one day they find 2,600 uncounted votes because they were on a memory card that was not plugged in. Next day they found 2,800 uncounted votes on another memory card. One was in Floyd County, others in Fayette County. Most recent one, I guess, was in Walton County. So that's why we do these recounts. Sometimes we find more votes. And, of course, we'll also spend a little bit of time tomorrow talking about what's going on up there in Michigan, because there was an attempt to actually certify the vote in Wayne County, and then a pushback from an individual who seemed to be doxing two of those individuals. And then the argument is we want to rescind our prior vote. So trying to figure all that out is going to be something we'll try to unfold as well. And most importantly, we'll be watching these two very important U.S. Senate races, which, as we talked about just a few minutes ago with Dr. Richard Land, are very important. So if you find yourself saying, okay, I want to get some more information, of course, yesterday we posted the evidence. Here's the evidence.com. We have it on the Thursday, actually it's on the Wednesday program that gives you a link to all of the allegations, the affidavits, and others on that. We've also posted today an article, Americans Don't Trust Their Government, another one, They Want You to Shut Up, which is by Ben Shapiro, and then one by, of course, Lockdown Lunacy, in which we were talking about that economic issue as well. So just a lot of issues that we've posted on the website, including, of course, information about O.S. Hawkins, Richard Land, and, of course, the conversation that we had a little bit earlier with Lysa Terkeurst. So all of that is available on the website, pointofview.net. And I hope that you'll take the time to take advantage of that. My Viewpoints commentary today is about how the clash of civilizations is affecting world missions. And we'll talk about that maybe in a future program. But we need to wind down the program for today. So again, want to thank Andrew for his help as the engineer, Steve for his help as a producer. We will take a break, and we will see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup.